I live about 30 minutes from there. There's Fall Creek Falls State Park, Rock Island State Park, Savage Gulf State Park. They all have waterfalls. They all have places they can go hike. I think it sets a bad precedence, in my opinion. You know, a guy gets the wildlife management areas. Mostly, I think, are visited by hunters who don't have the money to be part of a hunting club. So they get up at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, they go climb up a tree, they're sitting there waiting for daylight, and here comes a guy hiking through with his dog with a bell on. It's just, I think it sets a bad precedent.
Commissioner Baker, to get back up here and answer your question, last year during the archery hunt, we harvested 10 deer on Bridgestone. Yes, sir.
How many acres is that?
10,000.
It's 10,000 acres. Could whoever, you and whoever, could we see a situation where some of the more, I mean, it's 10,000 acres, there's got to be a compromise where some areas are open that are more desirable for hiking, closer to the parking lot or whatever it may be, closer to whatever features people want to go take pictures with or whatever it may be, and then some areas that are more conducive to bow hunting. I mean, something else that we might could look at, 'cause I don't know, this is kind of new to me, and you know, obviously I know they're not going to give us any non-hunting areas to start archery hunting in, which would be great. I know some of those would probably be pretty good places, but obviously that's not an option. So maybe we could, you know, have some other options. I don't know what geographic kind of boundaries or roads, or I don't know enough about
Yes,
it
sir.
to say this, but there may be some areas where we could designate during these times, or maybe always, you know, that are, I'm not familiar enough. But
Just, again, off the top of my head, it would be hard to do that just because of the way the Centennial Wilderness is. We basically have what we call the upper area on top, and that's when we talk about our quail focus area, that's where we do a lot of the quail work. So we're burning, it's wide open for the most part. And then pretty immediately you drop off into the gorge. And that's, you know, the trails go from the top and they pretty immediately drop off into the gorge. So it would be, I'm not saying it's impossible by any stretch, but it would be, it could get complicated really quickly if we started trying to zone areas off or even designate trails, and because there's also multiple trails that go down in there, and the hunters and hikers, it's really a unique area to hunt too. It's to get down into some of those areas, you know, it's a gorge, and you know, they use a lot of the same trails just to access the areas, that being the hikers and the hunters. So I'm not saying it would just be something that would, I'm afraid, would get really complicated really quick.
we often hear about hunters not having places to hunt and lack of, and I realize we have to be open to all our user groups, but I've never had anybody call me and say he didn't have anywhere to hike. But I want to look into this further. I'm glad it's not up for vote today, because I wouldn't, you know, feel comfortable at all. But, you know, the bow hunters have 40 days out of the year.
Yes, sir.
So, I mean, just something that I think we need to take a long, hard look at. Obviously, we will. Go ahead. Director Carter?
Kind of want to get Kirk off the hook here, since I asked Region 3 to bring this forward. I want to give you a little background on why I asked them to do that. I thought it was worthy of consideration by this group, and obviously you have the decision on what that would be. But I break our management areas out into two distinct groups, and that being the ones that were bought and paid for with hunter fees, and those that were either bought with wetlands funds or gifts. And Centennial Wilderness area was a gift to the state of Tennessee, and partially have been augmented by those lands by some wetlands funds, which of course are general fund money. So there's a series of trails that go through that area, I was thinking it was like 15,000 acres in total. And, yeah, but anyway, of that whole area up there, there's a Latimer Scout area that's connected to the thing, and the scouts are building trails that go through there. They want interrelated trails that go through that same area, so you can go from one area to the other. So the request to us was would we allow the thing to be open 365 days a year? We felt like that during the gun hunts especially, that was not a good idea. There's always a safety concern, but also because in the archery season, I don't know the numbers, but based on what Kirk said and my recollection that I had, there's not a whole ton of archery hunters that hunt the area, but even if they do, during that time of year, you got leaves that are on the tree, you don't have a great distance that you can see. So one of the things I used to like so much about archery hunting, you couldn't tell anybody was close to you, even though they might have been 50 yards of you. But in any case, you had vegetation there, and in October is one of the prime months, obviously, for people wanting to see the fall colors and to go from one area to the other on an extended hike. So I asked the region to put that into the regulations so that y'all could consider it, because it'll be shut during part of November, part of December, and I guess a little bit in January. No January, just part November and December. So anyway, it was to give you all a chance to consider whether or not utilizing these other lands to allow hiking during that month, and if it would be disruptive or it wouldn't be disruptive. If it was a Catoosa, a Cheatham, a Laurel Hill, those that were specifically bought with hunter funds and managed by hunter funds, then I don't think there's any question about it. That's why those areas were set up. These are built more on a multiple use thing. It's what our strategic plan says. So I put it forward for y'all's consideration, and just wanted you to know that's how it got to Region 3. If you got any questions for me, I'd be glad to try to answer them, but I just wanted to give you that background. Thank you.
Do you think it might be a good idea to hear from the hunters at the next meeting to see if there's any opposition?
I'm sure they'll all have opposition. I mean, right, I mean, I guess if the hikers had a bow and a license, they could hike all they wanted already. Maybe that'd be easier than this discussion. I don't want to linger on this, but I think there was some WMA proclamation, or there was some West Tennessee hunting areas in here that said same as statewide. Is that including spring turkey? Because I think we'd kind of made some decisions, I know on some of the WMAs, to delay the opening of spring turkey season because of some issues with flooding and nesting success. And I didn't know, because it was a lot of slides, but I don't know. It may be.
If I could call on Jim, I think he could probably cover that better than I can. Jim Hamilton.
There may have been specific WMAs, but
Jim Hamilton, Wildlife Program Manager, Region 1. It's, those are new, those were old wetland tracks. They were all wetland tracks, were open to hunting, and they weren't in the hunting guide, just the local people. For instance, Spring Creek is about 400 acres, Perry Switch is 300, there's turkeys there. Very few people know where they are, but it's open to spring turkey hunting, same as statewide seasons, but no fall turkey hunting.
but we have WMAs that are similar habitat that we decided to.
We did.
To
We did. Those were the ones closest to the Mississippi River and the ones we had the quota hunts on. And the reason being for those was it opens tomorrow. All the WMAs over the bigger WMAs would get a lot more pressure open tomorrow, and hopefully that'll spread the pressure out, the hunting
Perry
pressure
Switch
out.
is by the fairgrounds, right?
Colonel Forrest Durand is the fairgrounds.
Yeah, that gets plenty of pressure because I get,
Oh, do you?
yeah.
Oh, at the fairgrounds?
Evidently, I mean, I get a lot of
There's-
calls about the usage and the lack of access and infrastructure, and
And that's what we're
It's
going to try to improve the access on Forrest Durand or fairgrounds. And Perry Switch is the one off of Deep Gap Road. And then Perry Switch Road is on the backside of it.
Yeah, she made a good point earlier about, you know, everything that's TWRA owned or managed, you know, people expect to have a certain level of management infrastructure, but, you know, it really takes the same amount of work to move equipment and work on 5,000 acres as it does to move and work on a 400. And I realize, you know,
Yes.
we're limited. It's just, it's almost impossible to manage all of those equally. So I hope, you know, from a public standpoint, I think sometimes they go to one WMA and it's got trails and signs and it's a lot of, we've done so much work to make them better, and which they expect that everywhere, which is not possible. But like, they call me and I try to explain that, but maybe we can
Yes, and I think
differentiate or explain PHA versus WMA in the book, or I don't know.
PHA, when, so talking to Tim Churchill about it, it was anything less than 50 acres or 30 acres, I believe.
100.
Oh, it was 100? Okay. And that's kind of what he was using. And these are small areas, all of them are 300 acres or better. And these are areas where we're trying to add on to. For instance, Beach River, WMA, we're trying to buy some land from Miller Lumber Company right next door to it and double the size and build on those.
Okay, well, maybe by the next time we could look at the turkey stuff in the spring and see if, you know, we're fine where it is, or I think some of what we did on those WMAs was to not have the quota issue and then also try to stay away from reducing the harvest in those counties for, you know, there was some things being thrown around because the turkey numbers were so low, and I think we settled on opening late because that was
It's opening later and
the
cutting
lesser
the
of
season
three
back.
evils, but
Is trying to reduce the hunting pressure on on the WMAs.
well, okay. These would fall into it or no?
We could.
I mean, saying
We
maybe
could.
something to consider. You know, if we think it's a
we could
good
do that.
management procedure, we should probably use it everywhere that's similar, or at least discuss it,
Okay.
I think.
Anything else?
I mean, anybody?
Yeah, I've got a question about Joy, and maybe I'm just showing my ignorance. I do that a lot. But we just proclaimed over the last 2-3 months, 15 or so, 20 public hunting areas to WMAs. And the reason was because we had to proclaim them WMAs because public hunting area wasn't an option. So I don't understand why we've got this explanation. Not that it really matters, but, you know, we had a lot of Wolf River WMA Unit 2 is made up of 150 to 700 to 1,500 acre parcels that are not contiguous. They were all public hunting areas, and now they're all WMAs. So why do we do that? If they're not going to be intensively managed. They're just going to be public hunting areas. So I don't understand why we did that.
I hope I didn't misspeak. We're not proclaiming any areas. These areas that we've been proclaiming over the past few months were never proclaimed in the first place. So we're just using the PHA designation to communicate to the public what to expect on these areas, which is when they get on a PHA, it's not going to look like a WMA in terms of habitat management. Now, as far as Wolf River is, the parcels that have been purchased over the, I guess in the recent past, I think are close enough in as far as the water drainage system and where they are. And they don't touch, but they're still managed by the same manager, using the same equipment. And so they are considered part of Wolf River WMA.
But they don't move equipment around on this land. So I guess it doesn't matter, but if they're gonna be WMAs, then the public's gonna expect some kind of WMA management there, and there's not gonna be. Right, Alan?
If you don't mind, may Alan come and speak?
So if there's gonna be an expectation of intensive management on a WMA, these are proclaimed incorrectly.
Well, let me try to clarify this a little bit, I think. And I don't want to step on anybody's toes or misspeak, so if one of our attorneys wants to slap me, go ahead. There was some concern that we had a lot of lands that we didn't really tell the public were out there. They weren't in the hunting guide, we didn't have maps, so there was a push for us to let the public know these places existed. We had all that Wolf River land and a lot of other scattered little tracts that they were just out there, and if you were a local, you knew about it. If you weren't a local, you didn't know how to even identify that there was a place. So the determination was made, hey, we need to do something to identify these hunting areas to everybody in the state. And so we said, okay, we've got to either call them a PHA or a WMA or a refuge or something. And kind of just pick a number out of a hat, but 100 acres or less, it's PHA. Anything bigger than that, it's a WMA. It may just be open with statewide season and bag limits, and we don't do any intensive management, but it was over 100 acres. That's kind of what happened. It was to let the public know you can go hunt there. Does that make sense?
Let me jump in here just a minute, and that is, I think you understand the nature of the question. What Commissioner Cox is asking is very fair.
Right.
On one side, we have a definition telling the public that if it is called this, then these things are or are not going to happen. And now we have an acreage threshold that's weaving its way into this, and there's some confusion. Commissioner Cox, with your permission, I would like to ask staff to answer your questions, sit down together, explain exactly what the parameters are, and maybe on these specific WMAs or where it differentiates on a WMA. Let's say a WMA is not going to be intensively managed. We need to know that by the next meeting. Today is a preview. I think you're getting a preview of the questions we have, and I'd like to give you all the chance to come up with a formal answer. I know you're having to talk off your feet right now, and I'm trying to give you a little breathing time to give a good response. It is a very, very fair question.
I think there.
Alan, do me a favor. Let's go back, okay? Let's come up with an answer. I'm trying to help you out, buddy. Thank you.
I think you're right. It doesn't make any difference to me. When George said they were gonna be managed a different way, we don't want public expectation to be one way and we're getting something else, so.
Just a little clarification on that. Will there be some real small WMAs that will be, their name will change from a WMA to a public hunting area?
I could be wrong, but I'm not, if we're using the acreage threshold as a definition, I don't think we have any under 100 acres that are currently proclaimed as WMAs.
The one at Alvin C. York Institute. 10 acres? 5?
It's larger than that.
With due respect to time and the question and giving the question fairness, we would like the commission is asking for a comprehensive answer on these new properties being designated as PHAs, WMAs, and what the expectations are on the management of it. And we would like to have that in hand before the next meeting, and we'll discuss it at the next meeting. Is that fair? Thank you.
All right. So really quick, I'd like to talk about the proclamation that declares seasons for the National Wildlife Refuges. National Wildlife Refuges are national. They are federally owned lands, and the federally employed managers on these lands collaborate with each other and come up with the recommended changes. Our state season setting system is just a mechanism for them to set their seasons. So TWRA and the federal managers of these lands don't work together to come up with these. We just do them a courtesy so we can proclaim them. But we would like to tell you what they've recommended. On Hatchie, they recommended closing the area west of I-40, Interstate 40, during some deer hunts and some squirrel seasons, spring squirrel seasons. And then on Chickasaw and Lower Hatchie, they recommend closing hunting seasons in relevant areas when the Mississippi River reaches 28 feet, which is considered the major flood stage. And then on Reelfoot and Lake Isom National Wildlife Refuges, they're recommending adding a deer young sportsman quota hunt. And this is all the notable changes noted in that particular proclamation that relates to national wildlife refuges.
I'm sorry to keep asking questions. The area west of I-40,
Hatchie National Wildlife Refuge is a super long, skinny area, and I-40 cuts kind of down, separating about a quarter of it. I mean, it looks like a snake.
north and south. I-40's, I'm confused with it. So I-40 runs east. My brain may have quit working. We've been here a while, but
If
How do we close
I-40
the area?
runs east and west, Hatchie's kind of like a snake, and the head of it crosses up over 40. And that quarter of it is the quarter that they're putting restrictions on.
okay. I'm good. Any more? Go ahead, I'm sorry. You good?
Yeah,
That's
this concludes it. Unless there are questions, I can move on to the next proclamation. Okay. The next proclamation covers the Holston Army Ammunition Plant. And currently, this proclamation designates this area as a wildlife refuge. And we recommend reproclaiming this area as a waterfowl refuge. This was requested by the Department of Defense, and this is to allow them to initiate fishing and hunting on this area. The wildlife refuge designation made this impossible, but the waterfowl refuge definition will free up some possibilities.
Does that mean we'll be able to fish inside Holston Defense? I got pulled up one time. I had two MPs hold M16s on me and say, "Mr. Baker, you've been inside here 3 times in the last week. If you can't read, we're going to escort you out." I said, "Yes, sir."
And if you'd like, I can move on to the next proclamation, unless there's questions. Okay. And that would be the purview of Darren Ryder, Chief of Boating and Law Enforcement Division, to preview the Manner and Means Proclamation. Oh, you had these arrows.
Arrow.
Yeah, that goes right, that goes back, that goes forward, that goes backwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. This is a preview of the 16-17 recommended changes for the manner and means of hunting, trapping, and taking. So with that, if you have your red line copies, it might be easier to follow along. These basic amendments, there's just a couple, 2 or 3, are for clarity and housekeeping. So if you can go to Section 2, underneath prohibited acts, underneath 7F, this is for clarification. The current language is any electronic light amplifying night vision scope or device while in possession of a firearm or archery tackle between sunset and sunrise. With the questions we were calling in today's latest technology, what we'd like to do is make the recommended change in the language to include any electronic light amplifying night vision scope, thermal imaging device, or other similar devices while in possession of a firearm or archery tackle between sunset and sunrise. Now, if you'll drop down to Section 6, underneath big game check, there's a couple amendments there. This first one is underneath paragraph 1, and it's basically a housekeeping item. So after check-in, documentation on approved TWRA forms or TWRA mobile app shall be available for inspection by TWRA personnel until the time of final processing. So for housekeeping, basically, we want to change this for after check-in, documentation of the TWRA confirmation number from an approved TWRA check-in station, TWRA website, or TWRA mobile app shall be available for inspection. So what this is, there's basically no approved TWRA forms. All we're asking is simply document the confirmation number and be able to present it through one of these three methods. Now, at that last paragraph underneath Section 6, big game check, it currently says evidence of the animal's sex, species, and antler status, if applicable, must remain with the animal while afield. Our recommended change is to add the sentence there at the end to say additionally, turkeys must remain intact until checked in. So basically, for a law enforcement assistant is check it before you dress it. That's kind of what we're looking for. Our last change will be underneath Section 7, underneath miscellaneous. If you go down to number 7, during a deer archery only season, a fall turkey hunter may not be in possession of both archery equipment and firearms. Our recommend changes is to strike that last word firearms and include shotguns and or rifles. This is for clarity because of the calls in regards to the handgun carry permit law. So the hunter can actually be in possession of a handgun with a permit, or vice versa on private property. You know, that person will have the right to have a handgun. So we just want to clarify that. Those are the recommended changes. Any questions? Commissioner Teague, looks like you may have something. Okay.
Anybody have a question? That concludes the business of the Wildlife Committee.
Chairman Teague, you've done a yeoman's job today, and we covered a lot of ground in a one-day meeting, so thank you. Thank you for running with this and organizing it. The commission recognizes Chairman Holbert with Government Relations Committee.
I'd like to call on Mr. Chris Richardson. He's in a hurry. He's already up there.
I'm
Give us a
here.
legislative update.
In light of the marathon meeting that you all have already had and kind of where we are in the legislative session, I'm going to keep my comments pretty brief. I'll answer any questions that you have. Essentially, the legislature is probably going home next Wednesday or Thursday. As it stands now, there haven't been any significant or noteworthy pieces of legislation that have become law that I feel I need to update you guys on right now. There are obviously some things that I want to tell you about in more depth, but I think that's probably best reserved for the May meeting after the legislature goes home. So with that, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, I'll answer any questions that you have.
I don't see any questions.
See you next month.